Matt, I want to start with this case of Aaron Bushnell. It was so tragic to see him setting himself on fire outside the Israeli embassy.
Yeah.
And he wrote on his Facebook that many of us like to ask ourselves, what would I do if I was alive during slavery, during apartheid? What would I do if my country was committing genocide? The answer is you're doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the sadness and the anger that I approach this with, I think, is shared by many. I mean, you saw how poignant this young man was in his final moments. In everything we know about him, he obviously was an intelligent young man, a passionate young man. People loved him. So what might have been, what would he have done with his life? What could he have done for his community, for others? And so just as his self-immolation was an act of resistance, Nima was a great and loud and extreme protest. It also was a consequence of this war, of the wide and great wreckage of this war. He was a victim of this war, and that the self-violence that he took part in, again, an act of resistance, something that we should recognize and memorialize, not celebrate. I think there's a distinction, but something we do need to respect and utilize in our purposes to oppose genocide, war, and occupation. But that self-violence, that self-immolation, that suicide, was an extension of the greater violence of the war in Gaza. Aaron Bushnell became an agent of the war just as much as anyone else who was a participant in it. I mean, so the degree at which we approach this, I think, has to be balanced in the sense that we have to recognize his goal was to communicate, which I think he did quite clearly and quite well, the complicity of both through his stated words as well as by the implications of his act, the complicity of the United States in the genocide in Gaza, and by extension, then all Americans, but most especially those who are in the armed forces. But you also have to realize too that he was dealing with a moral injury. He was dealing with the guilt, the shame, the regret of wearing a uniform that was causing tremendous, tremendous harm and suffering to millions and millions of people, and that this harm and suffering was not a one-off, that there's a great, tragic, sordid, horrific line through history of the American military doing such things, and not for the protection of the American people, not for the national security of the United States or any other interests of the broader or wider interests of the United States, but for the very narrow political, economic, and financial interests of the American empire. So, Aaron may have realized or may have thought at times that by being in the Air Force, he was wearing a white hat. But as we see, because journalists are starting to go through his history, including his online history, he seemed to have contributed a lot on Reddit forums. And as everyone knows, it's a bit dangerous, a bit fraught to try and get a full and complete picture from the snippets of people's lives that they post online. But what we are starting to see emerge is somewhat of a picture of a young man who entered the U.S. military, not out of patriotism or a sense of duty or wide-eyed expectation, but out of financial need. That's at least the story The Intercept was speaking of today, right? So he graduates high school, and it's not until 4 years after he graduated high school that he joins the Air Force. And there are indications that he was in financial difficulty. And again, this is all from what's being culled from his social media. So how much of the context and the background are we really getting here? But this is what we have to try and understand and piece together, because we want to understand as best we can what motivated him to commit this act, where he was coming from. And we also want to have as best an understanding of all the contributing factors so that we as we approach these wars, as we approach this genocide, as we approach this occupation, we understand all the confluences, we understand all the inputs, we understand how everything contributes and how that ends up in this place where this young man who had such a future, who left behind so much. You could see this from the testimonials of his friends who are speaking about him. He chose this act. And to your question about whether or not it will have an effect on the Biden administration, I don't think so at all. I don't think they even know that this occurred, other than the fact that it's a nuisance, an irritant, other than the fact that the Israelis probably lodged a major complaint to the State Department about it. You know what I mean? So it's a nuisance. It's an irritant. It's obnoxious to them, and I think that's all how they're going to see it. But I think you have to maybe look at this notion that as Aaron spoke and as he died, his communication, he chose to be in front of the Israeli embassy, of course, and he certainly, by wearing his uniform, was connecting with members of the U.S. military. But I think in a lasting sense, his sacrifice, his death, is going to be most impactful on those who are already doing this work, because it will serve as a galvanizing force. It will serve as a solidifying force. It will serve as something that we must recognize and respect and remember. And if anything, give us greater strength to continue our work opposing not just this genocide, not just this occupation, not just this war, but all such things.
How long these politicians can keep these kind of policies that they're not representing the U.S. public opinion?
Well, unfortunately, I think they can keep these positions and these policies as long as the money is supporting them. I think that's a very unfortunate but real circumstance that we are up against. That if you go back and you look at, say, occurs in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s with the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, the environmental movement, in the early 80s, you have an anti-nuclear movement that gets a couple million people in the Central Park. Right. I mean, so what you have is you have a response from the establishment, right, from the empire, from the elites, however you want to describe it. But they recognize the danger of this type of mass mobilization, of this type of organization, of people power. And what they do is they start insulating the political system. And they do this through campaign finance reform. It's interesting. I was just reading something about how in the 50s, this really starts to change in the sense that if you go back prior to the 50s, you get more of the Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, where corruption in D.C. occurred in the direct bribing of politicians to sponsor particular pieces of legislation. And it's more about payoffs and direct bribes. But then through the 40s and 50s, that starts to change, particularly with the advent of television and how much more expensive campaigning becomes. And so what you then have is you have a shift in the corruption, where it goes from being kind of direct backroom payoffs to more out in the open campaign financing. Right. So, and of course, don't get me wrong. I'm not dismissing that there isn't that type of corruption still occurring. But in terms of what dominates, in terms of what you can look at how our political system operates, it's that type of out in the open secrets, which I'm referring to that great website that people should go to understand how this all works and to see the money that actually gets put into our political system and how it influences, how it orders, how it directs and controls our government. And so as long as that exists, as long as that the people in power are insulated by the money, and as long as there are other contributing effects, right, such as gerrymandering on the state legislative and on the federal House levels, where the districts are so carved up, or what's the expression? The people don't choose their legislatures; the legislatures choose their people. Right. So, in the sense that things like that only strengthen an incumbent's ability to stay in power or a party's ability to keep power. It's so what we are up against then too. And then one more thing to add into this, I know this is definitely not a positive or optimistic, I know I'm not saying anything positive or optimistic here, but you also have to understand the type of people who are going into elected office, and we see this even down on the local level, right? But people are going into office for the sake of power, power for power's sake. Not that they want to get power so that they can then deliver healthcare to people, or they can clean up the environment, or they can get rid of estate taxes, or whatever noble type of vision they have, right? You see that less and less because the people who the system wants are the people that want the system, right? The people who want power for power's sake, for who the means are the ends. And so when you look at the most senior levels, then you look at a Joe Biden's, a Tony Blinken's, those types, you see men and women who the seat that they are in is the end game. That is the pursuit. They do not have visions of policies. They do not have a desire to improve things. They do not have even a constituency for which they feel ultimately responsible, beholden, or accountable to, other than their donors. And so you have this self-reinforcing effect, right? Where you have this system that has been insulated with money that gets to choose not just who its candidates are, but who the people are who vote for the candidates. And then you have the candidates themselves, the incumbents themselves, who like that system, who are creatures of that system, who swim in that system so well. And so then when there are actual threats to the system, when there are threats electorally, it's very easy to pick them off. And you can see that in 2022, where AIPAC, the American Israel Political Affairs Committee, but we can expand this, Nima, to talk about all types of issues. This is just not confined to foreign policy or to Israel and Palestine. This affects big pharma, big agriculture, Wall Street, any of the industries, the major industries and interest groups, as well as anything that touches the elites in power. So what you see happen in 2022 is you have AIPAC intervene in U.S. House races, not on the general election level, but in the primary, and particularly in Democratic primaries. And I believe they spend more than $20 million in 16 House races. And AIPAC brags that they were successful in 15 of those races. Summerlee in Pennsylvania, the only race they're not successful in. But otherwise, they intervene in 15 Democratic primaries, if I have my numbers right, 15 Democratic primaries with millions of dollars. And they ensure that the progressive candidates are defeated. And so you see that ability of these interests, these lobby groups, these elites, these industries to intervene and ensure that any danger to them is nullified, or if not nullified, minimized. And so I think that's what we're looking at here in a sense of what we're up against. And this is a Leviathan. This is a wall 1,000 feet high. We cannot think we are going to defeat it by running headlong into it. I'm reminded that people remember there was a South Park episode, oh my God, more than 20 years ago. And people are upset, teachers are upset, parents are upset with the local school. And so they strap themselves into catapults and fling themselves against the wall of the school, against the brick wall of the school. They just splat up against it, right? And that's always been for me, that South Park episode, that South Park clip has always been so instructive, because that's often what we do, running headlong into that great wall of power, right into the arms of the Leviathan. And so we have to find ways asymmetrically to reduce their power, remove them from power, or threaten their power. Because again, this action by, say, Aaron Bushnell doesn't threaten by itself, doesn't threaten Joe Biden's power, right? It doesn't threaten Tony Blinken's power. It doesn't threaten Mitch McConnell or Chuck Schumer. But are there ways to utilize what Aaron did to threaten in other ways, in other means, their hold on power. And one of the things you could see then what happens is, we'll never know this because no one's ever going to, maybe some PhD student at some point will try and do it. But you had over 100,000 Michigan voters go to the polls. I don't live in Michigan, so I don't know. It's probably pretty cold there, earlier this week. It's February and it's Michigan. But, they had more than 100,000 people went out to the polls in Michigan in the Democratic primary to vote uncommitted, to issue a vote against Joe Biden. They didn't vote for Dean Phillips. They didn't vote for Marianne Williamson, who got about 40,000 votes between them. They voted uncommitted. This was a middle finger to the President of the United States, to the leader of their party. How many of them were further motivated to do that by Aaron Bushnell's self-immolation? I mean, I don't know if we'll ever have an answer to that, but that's the type of thing where you start to see how this is effective, how this is helpful. And again, I want to say we don't want to celebrate Aaron's death in the sense that he was in tremendous pain. He was suffering. And for him, this act of self-immolation was a cleansing method, right? It was a way to atone, was a way to repent. One of the things that we've seen come out of his Reddit profile is this message where he talks about he says, I will never be able to get this blood off of my hands, right? And so for all of us who sat through, I'm not sure how it was for you, Nima, but if you sat through an American high school, you read Macbeth, right? And how many people, when you hear that phrase, I can't get this blood off my hands, you recall Lady Macbeth, out damn spot, right? And this gets to the whole issue of moral injury, this guilt, this shame, this regret, because he had transgressed. He was complicit with a genocide. And this gets back to his last and final words, his last message about the complicity of the United States, the armed forces, and all Americans in this genocide in Gaza. And he says so poignantly about how if you were living in, people wonder, they contemplate what they would do if they were living during the Holocaust or during the Jim Crow era. But they're living through it now. They're living through the same type of event. And so we will see how his action is not just remembered, but utilized. And hopefully it will be of assistance in continuing to fight these wars and occupation and genocide.
We have Americans, we have the outside world, we have other countries, we have Brazil. Recently, President Lula was comparing what's going on in Gaza to Germany. Is it going to have some sort of pressure on the Biden administration and their policy, or is not going to change anything?
I think, again, it gets back for me, this idea of what threatens their power, what makes them pay attention, what do they care about? And all these things can culminate in various contributing efforts and factors, we said. So I think what we're seeing with the Biden administration is very petty attempts to assuage the political concerns. And we can look at what happened in Michigan again as an example, where the way the Biden administration, knowing this was an issue, I mean, the first days back in October, people said this was going to be an issue. I mean, in October, we were already talking about how this support for Israel is going to hurt Biden in the elections, and how he will have to make a decision. His campaign will have to make a decision if he's even still the candidate, which I think is something we've discussed before about how he may likely not be the candidate. How is Joe Biden just taking all this for the team right now, and then they'll replace him. And then, of course, it won't be the new candidate's genocide. It'll be Biden, the old guy's genocide, right? Is that what's occurring here? But we had these discussions months ago, right, about this trade-off of losing progressive voters, but not angering AIPAC, not angering the Israel lobby, and losing that money and losing that clout and their effectiveness, as well as angering conservative members of the Democratic Party who are Zionists. And we have to remember, of course, that there's no bigger Zionist in Washington, D.C. than Joe Biden. So, I think what they're trying to do, if you go back to what happened in Michigan, is that the way the Biden administration approached Michigan was political. And what they did was they sent people from the campaign to meet with the Arab American community in Michigan. And the Arab American community in Michigan turned them away. They said, we don't want to talk to you. We don't want to talk to your campaign manager. This isn't about getting votes. This is about people's lives. This is about this great moral horror. This is about genocide and starvation and miseration and disease and organized murder. And so they did, and they sent back some policy people. But then you see also too, in the night before the primary in Michigan, Joe Biden eating an ice cream cone so glibly and so out of touch with what his policies are actually doing to real people. Says how we'll have a ceasefire deal on Monday. And of course, the next day, both Hamas and the Israelis are like, we have no idea what he's talking about. Nothing has changed. Nothing has improved. So unless Hamas and the Israelis are both just trying to obfuscate here for a little while longer, it appears that attempt by Joe Biden on, late night television was to try and get people in Michigan to be like, oh, things are going to get better. And so I think what you're seeing too is you're seeing probably behind the scenes, the Americans saying to Israelis, hurry up and get it done. Get this invasion of Rafah over with so that we can put it behind us, and then we can complain. We can then say that anything that occurs further on is no longer part of the war. It's because of the security situation. It's because Hamas is out there doing criminal acts or these are acts of God, or it's just because the Palestinians aren't organized enough to feed their own people. We can take the blame off of Israel, just get this done, and it'll get this monkey off our backs. Because again, these are all people, even in the policy positions. Most of the people in the policy positions are political animals. They see things through a campaign lens. And so their expectation is that people by November will have moved on, will have forgotten about this, or at least that's their hope. And that hope seems maybe to be their strategy as well. But this idea of like, hurry up, Israel, get this invasion of Rafah over with, I think is something that we're seeing. And then the danger, of course, aside from the genocide, right, and everything that comes with it. And we're seeing projections now coming out of places like, I think it was Johns Hopkins, that say, expectations of maybe as many as 75,000 more people are to die in Gaza before this is said and done. The idea behind the White House that they can control Israel, that, okay, Netanyahu, you can continue to go through with this. Just hurry up, get it done, finish your plan for Gaza, finish your eradication, get your political points, get one step closer to your ethnic cleansing goal of a greater Israel, all those things. And the White House thinks in this really obscene American way that they can control what the Israelis are going to do next. And we have seen this over and over and over again. This, of course, is what's called blowback, right? The greatest example is what happens with Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. But we also see it too. What happens with the very same people that are in the White House now, the very same people that are in the State Department and at the Pentagon, at the CIA, at the NSC. These are the same people that more than a decade ago thought that they could control the reactionary religious jihadist elements in Syria, those who had come out of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, okay? They thought that they could control these people for their purposes so that they could take AQI, now rebranded as the Islamic State, and use them to overthrow Assad. And essentially, we could take these jihadists and we can point them at Damascus, and they will go west and they'll overthrow Assad, and they will not turn around and go east and cross that literal line in the sand and go back into Iraq, where most of them came from. I mean, these are the same people who thought they could control that, who thought that they could manage that. Right? I mean, in the same way that they thought that they could manage the war in Ukraine, that this will give, we will do to Russia what we did to them in Afghanistan. We will give them their own Iraq. These are the minds that were in power then and are in power now. So their thoughts that we can control Netanyahu in his ilk, that we will tell them they can, or we will not, maybe not say it explicitly because we don't want to ever get this leaked, but we will, through our actions and through our relationship with them, they will understand that they can finish the job in Gaza, but they're not to move on to the West Bank. We're not going to let them rename the West Bank Judea and Samaria and annex it. We're not going to allow them to invade Lebanon. We're not going to allow them to, do whatever else they're going to do, attack Iran or whatnot. I mean, these people think that they can control Netanyahu and his people and his like after all their experiences in the face of the whole thing that we talked about before, where the Israel lobby controls them. I mean, this is the thing that's so horrific, right, Nima, is that even if Joe Biden was to wake up tomorrow morning and say, that's it, I'm done, I'm through with it, no more weapons, no more bombs to Israel, Netanyahu, call it off right now, the U.S. Congress would override the president. There are well more than enough votes in the House and the Senate to get military aid to Israel, to bombs to Israel, to money to Israel, in spite of whoever's in the Oval Office. Well more than enough votes to override a presidential veto on that. So even if you didn't have the most Zionist person in Washington, D.C. occupying the Oval Office, you'd still have this issue where Israel effectively controls the U.S. policy when it comes to Israel. So, I mean, what we're up against here is really is not just damning and terrible in the moment, Nima, but also what could happen, what could come from this. And one of these things being is that we have clueless, wooden-headed fools in leadership who think that because they're good at running an American political system of legalized bribery and winning crooked and corrupt and gerrymandered elections, that somehow they are able to control forces overseas, as well as, what you could call supernatural forces like war.
We have huge clashes in Tel Aviv against the Netanyahu administration and their policy. Do you think that is not a great opportunity for the Biden administration, if it's in favor of progressives in Israel, to help them at least getting some momentum to grow stronger?
Yeah, you would think, right? I mean, we get back to this issue of how power actually is really working in Washington, D.C., but you would think that a sane or a intellectually decent or a savvy American administration will be doing everything it can to support those in opposition to the Netanyahu government, as well as those who are arguing for a ceasefire. So it is. You look at this, and it's just one more example of where do these people think this is going to go? What do they think is going to happen? You continue to provide this support for Netanyahu, then what do you think the outcome is going to be? You think all of a sudden he's going to start being nice to you, and you think all of a sudden he's going to start working with you, and he's not going to be on his own path, achieving his own personal victories. I mean, the man talks about victory all the time, and that's all the victory he talks about is related to himself. Whether it's his militarist ideology of a greater Israel or his own political survival, this is the man that we have there, that is there. And it's clear he didn't just show up in October. This guy's been around for a very long time. So the fact that they continue to work with him and are not undermining him, and I think you'll hear these like really weak and lame and just pathetic attempts from the administration's apologists, whether they be, behind official podiums or pundits on cable news networks. And, these protests from them that, the Biden administration is doing everything it can. I mean, as we send 3 plane loads of bombs every day to Israel, doing everything we can. And we're using really strong language behind closed doors. And words matter. A couple of weeks ago, that was, the email must have gone out that morning to all these sycophants and apologists and talking heads use the phrase "words matter" because they start seeing it pop up there. Words matter, words matter. I think anyone who's got a brain in their head knows bombs matter a lot more. But but that's these unreal expectations. They're in addition, Nima, we talked about this before about how these many of these people are psychopaths. We were talking about that earlier, the power for power's sake kind of thing. Many of them also are fantasists and fabulous, right? So they inhabit a world that's not real. They are what the great American political scientist C. Wright Mills called crackpot realists. Yeah, I mean, so you have that as well, because there's never, as we were talking about Aaron Bushnell earlier, there's not one simple story, right? There never seems to be. If anyone has a simple story in their life, it's probably not worth telling, kind of thing. I mean, all of us are complex. And then when you're talking about the American empire, the interests that lead into it, the elites that control it, it's very complex. It's not monolithic at all. Which is why it's so difficult to describe it and to talk about it, because if we try and talk about it in singular or even binary terms, it becomes difficult to articulate because there are so many other factors, there are so many other interests, there are so many other inputs, and the elites themselves are not monolithic in a sense that they're all inhabiting some back room someplace smoking cigars. But I mean, this issue with Netanyahu and why, I mean, you wouldn't want maybe not go this far, but the idea of the American ambassador going onto the streets with those people, right? And that would be a great broach of decorum and a diplomatic diplomatic scandal. But it has been done before. And that certainly would signal to the Israelis that the United States was serious about this. I mean, even I've seen this suggested by others. Why are there not high-profile VIPs going into Gaza? Why are there not ambassadors standing at the gates of Rafah demanding to be let in? Right? If nothing more than just for the media spectacle of it and to cause this, diplomatic affront. I mean, so when you look at this, you do, I think all of us, Thema, right, get dismayed by it. We get despondent by the lack of seriousness, the lack of effectiveness, by the incompetence. But then we have to remember, and we know we're not being cynical here, we're being skeptical about what do these people really want to achieve. And Biden wants reelection. And Biden's such a good, loyal party man. He doesn't even care about, I don't think he really cares about reelection for himself. I think he cares about getting the eventual nominee for the Democratic Party, whoever it is they pick, to be in a position where they can win. And that means he has to take it on the chin over Gaza. He will. But again, recalling him again that he is self-described the biggest Zionist in Washington, D.C.
In your opinion, how influential is Europe on the Biden administration?
I think certainly the Biden administration is more sensitive to Europe than the Trump administration was or is if Trump is in power next year. And you do have that degree of difference. The Biden administration, they are politicians, they are psychopaths and fantasists and fabulous, but they are also accustomed to collaboration with their fellow elites, right? They're accustomed to having partners adjacent to them on their left and their right. These are people that occupy positions that require such things when they're not in office. So whether it's, say, like a Tony Blinken, who's going to go back to West Executive Advisors and help sell weapons, well, his only client is not just the United States government. His client is Western Europe. His client hopefully would be Eastern Europe. His client would be, wherever he can. So there is, even if it's in the self-interest, I think the Biden administration, those who make it up, are more inclined to be sensitive to the concerns of other nations, to be more collaborative, to at least listen and pay attention, and not to cause an affront, not to embarrass or not to anger. So, I mean, because they are, I mean, we oftentimes go down the road that there is no difference between the Republicans and Democrats. And in many ways, there's not. In many ways, there are. So in this case, I think that's one. But whether or not the Europeans have that great of an effect on the Americans. I don't know. This is not the same empire. I'm reminded that Margaret Thatcher, who of course was a hurricane of a personality, and you know, of course, my Irish roots, we curse her, but she had this effect on both Reagan and on George H.W. Bush. And she famously, I guess, in a moment of doubt, George H.W. Bush was not so confident in going forward with the first Iraq War, the Persian Gulf War of 1990, 1991. And she famously said to him, don't go all wobbly on me now, right? I mean, I don't think there's anyone in the last couple decades, maybe aside from the Blair-Bush relationship, that has had that type of effect on the Americans as, say, a Thatcher did or even a Blair did. And Blair, I think, was more of a being in cahoots, being a partner. And he also, too, is, I think, in the same vein. I mean, as you see him make his millions and millions and millions of dollars as a consultant or a shill for all these corporate interests, in the way that Tony Blinken will go back to doing when he is out of office. But yeah, I mean, certainly I'm trying to recall, you know, you've seen some anger coming from the Europeans. The head of foreign affairs for the EU, Joseph Borrell, has had some very strong and surprising words directed towards the Americans over Gaza. You know, directed a week or so ago, he said, you know, at the American claims that we're doing everything we can, he said, in a rather snide manner, why don't you try stop sending them bombs? You know, so there is that frustration, there is that anger. They see the pig-headedness, the arrogance of the Americans, but the Americans are who their car are tied to. And if they want any relevance, they have to remain with the American empire. I mean, in the American empire, in the hierarchy underneath it, they are at the top. And do they want to then go off on their own? To what? To align with who? To be under whose umbrella? They are declining in a multitude of ways, as the Americans are, whether it's their economy because of deindustrialization or because their populations are dwindling, whether it's because they have overspent and in many ways been just complete tax havens. I mean, so all these things that have weakened them over the decades put them in a position where can they go to? And then they also have a legacy. Many of them are sycophants, but they have a legacy themselves, a colonial legacy and a legacy of empires. If you go to these European capitals, you'll see all these statues to these, you know, you go to the Scandinavian countries, you see all these statues to these former admirals, you know, because they were once great seafaring, warring nations. You know, I mean, and so people who've been shocked these last decades by this notion of the Scandinavians as nations of peace, of nations of dialogue, of neutrality, seeing how quickly and enthusiastically they've jumped on the war bandwagon, whether it be first with Afghanistan, but now say too with like NATO ascension for both Finland and Sweden. You know, you understand that comes from a legacy they had and a desire to matter again, to desire to be part of the club, a desire to be first among the hierarchy in the American empire. You know, so I mean, I think that motivates Europeans just as much as those Europeans who look at this and say, this is madness, this is insanity, what's being done is a moral blight, this is against international law, as well as this is strategically unsound. For as many Europeans you have like that, you have those who want the proximity to power, want to be allied with the United States, again, for power's sake.
Matt, before wrapping up this session, I want to talk about Zelensky's interview with Fox News, in which he said that no one wants Avdiivka. If that was the case, why they were sacrificing a lot of people in Avdiivka? And why nobody's telling him? Because he said that Ukraine has no backup plan, no plan B. And who's gonna make this guy understand that Ukraine needs a plan B, needs a backup plan?
You know, I've got two literature references now in my head, right? The first being Mark Twain, who said, if it wasn't for a war, Americans wouldn't know geography. And it's true. We are learning all these names of villages and towns and cities in Ukraine, in Gaza, throughout the world. A decade ago, we were learning all these cities in Syria none of us had ever heard of before, right? So, I mean, but then the other thing as well is I think of Lear, King Lear, and the madness that enfolds him. And I think there is a madness that is capturing Zelensky. This is a man who was elected on a peace platform, who said he would speak with the Russians, he would meet with Vladimir Putin, he put an end to the war in eastern Ukraine. And then, of course, he was betrayed immediately. I don't know if betrayed is the right word, but he certainly was put in his place immediately by both the far right in Ukraine as well as by the West, particularly the Americans, and I would assume the British as well, too, in the sense that that's not going to happen. And then when Vladimir Putin and Russia go through with this invasion and there are a peace deal is available, it's agreed upon, he is made to walk away from that deal with these whispers in his ear that he will be the modern era's Winston Churchill. And as well as we will give you everything you need to win this war. And, those things don't come true. And he has been betrayed over and over again. He's been trapped. He's been manipulated. And has he become mad to where the point where he doesn't understand reality? And he doesn't understand that there is no winning this war. Maybe behind the scenes he does, but that's not what we've seen from the reports coming out from behind the scenes, right? I mean, there was that Time magazine report from about 5-6 months ago now. That journalist is never going to be invited back to the presidential palace in Kyiv. But, it was illuminating in that so many of his own people described him as going mad, as being delusional, as having a messianic complex. And this is really dangerous. And the thing that's only more dangerous than that is the fact that if Zelensky gets replaced, he's not going to be replaced by someone who wants to settle for peace. He's not going to be replaced by someone who is intellectually and morally decent. He's going to be replaced by someone who feels that he has now, this person who has taken power, that he has assumed this role in order to achieve victory for Ukraine. Zelensky couldn't do it. I'm going to do it. And where will this person come from? He'll come out of the far right. He'll come out of the ultranationalists. He'll come out of the neo-Nazis, the Banderites, as they get called. Right? I mean, and who that would be, I don't know. But we understand the makeup of who it would be and where they would come from. And so this danger of having a madman in Kyiv, or a man who's descending through madness, I should say, as opposed to the alternative, which would be someone from the far right who would see this as a cosmic struggle, as a historic struggle, who'd see the arc of history reflecting all throughout this fight, and bringing that type of metaphysical type of understanding to his reality. I mean, we talked about the fantasists and fabulists and the crackpot realists here in the United States. You would have an effect, someone like that empowering Kyiv, but also who was a racist, a racist ideologue. So the dangers here, just as we're talking about with Israel, things are bad and they could get much worse. Where it goes, why did you continue to defend that city if you're eventually going to give it up? So much of this is done for public relations. So much of this is done for the 24-hour news cycle. Any bad news is anathema, is an abomination. So put it off as long as you can. If we keep the town tonight, well, then at least the news tonight won't talk about it. We can worry about it tomorrow. That type of thing. And then you get to this point where you have this withdrawal. It's a disorderly withdrawal. There are reports that hundreds, if not more than 1,000 Ukrainian troops were killed during withdrawal. With military withdrawals are always difficult. Retreats are very difficult. They're often described as the most difficult thing to do. But now you've seen the Ukrainians are saying they've withdrawn from those cities as opposed to the Russians capturing them, 6.5 and 1 dozen. What's the difference in the longer scheme of this? So you do, so are the Ukrainians just in fact withdrawing and strengthening their lines? Were those towns that they just repeated from these last couple of days meaningless? I don't know. I mean, I know they were small towns. Were they in ground that was tactically indefensible? Did they have no operational meaning for the Ukrainians? Possibly, but we'll see. But being operationally, though, strategically, both countries, both Russia and Ukraine, are in a fix here. There's no victory within sight for either of them in your traditional World War II sense of military victory, right? So I have really terrible feeling, Nima, that barring a collapse, which I think has been staved off because of the effusion of the European cash, and then it will be see whether or not the Americans bring in money. But barring a collapse, which is possible again, because Ukraine is a house of cards, you and I will be having this conversation, if you still want to be talking to me, a year from now, right? We'll be still in the same position or we will, but Ukraine and Russia will more or less be in the same position, maybe a difference of kilometers or a couple dozen kilometers one way or the other. But that's why I think they're at, where neither side can achieve victory. So when we talk about stalemate, people get hung up on that term. We're not talking about a tactical stalemate. We're not talking about even an operational stalemate. We're talking about a strategic stalemate here. How do you achieve victory, right? In a sense that mollifies all the concerns, all the pressures, the very real pressures that exist in both Kyiv and Moscow, London and DC, Brussels, to allow for them to say, this is, if not victory, this is something we can live with. And we're so far away from seeing that right now. I think we could discuss that. We have discussed that and what that would look like, right? But we're so far away from it right now. And the fuel that's being thrown on the fire, with Macron this week saying, we're not ruling out sending troops into Ukraine. And then, of course, Vladimir Putin in the last day or so saying, don't forget, we've got nuclear weapons. The fuel here that's being lit could be catastrophic. And again, go back to this idea that things are bad, they can get much worse.
It's so amazing to see that they're not seeing what's going on right now between Ukraine and Poland. The farmers in Poland are so unhappy with the situation at the border, and Ukraine has no access to the Black Sea. And the Biden administration doesn't seem to see how important Odessa is for Ukraine.
Right, exactly. You have that diminization of Ukraine as a country, and not just the crushing loss of its people, hundreds of thousands of casualties. But you have this destruction of infrastructure. They've lost a good part of their industrial base. They've lost so much access to the Black Sea. As you said, they've got Odessa left, basically. But you also have this environmental destruction. You have a land that the estimates are it will take 300 years to clear it of all the landmines and unexploded ordnance, and let alone the toxic legacies of war. So people are going to be, Ukrainian mothers will be delivering babies generations from now that are deformed, that are debilitated, that are sick because of this war. This war will be passed down through the genes of mothers and fathers into infants not to be born for generations. I mean, that's the toxic legacy of modern war. We've seen that over and over again. If you don't understand that, go find a Vietnam vet or an Iraq vet, or better yet, a Vietnamese person or an Iraqi person, and they'll explain it to you. So this thing where, Ukraine really is running out of what would be a good settlement for us. And I don't know how likely it is Russia could take Odessa. I mean, that is take Kherson first and then to take Odessa. That's a long haul for Russia, and that really extends their line of communications. And I know there are many in the Russian camp in Russia who want Odessa, and it's been brought up over and over again by leadership, including implications from Vladimir Putin. So it certainly is an understandable goal. I mean, for all kinds of reasons, I understand why Russia would seek to take it. It's also a possible goal because, again, Ukraine is a house of cards, but it is a long haul. It is a long way. I mean, your lines of communications and then your extension out of predominantly Russian speaking areas into mixed areas. I'm not saying that they're all Ukrainian areas. I'm saying that they're mixed areas allows for you now really become an army of occupation. You're not an army of occupation in Donbass. Many people there see you as liberating heroes, but you keep extend farther west you go, the less it becomes that, and the more it becomes an army of occupation. And that just has to give pause to anyone with any intelligence in the Kremlin. And I think Vladimir Putin is a man like that. But dangers are, say our crackpot realists are correct. The fantasists and fabulous get it right this time, and there is regime change in Russia. Well, who's going to take over Putin's spot? Just as we were talking about Zelensky, it's not going to be some bright-eyed, big-hearted, Western influence reformer. It's going to be someone to Putin's right, someone much worse than Putin. Someone, I mean, we probably not even maybe even heard his name before, at this point, because that's a lot of times these things happen quickly in terms of, holy cow, who is this guy? Where did he come from? But this movement was always there, and certainly there are folks who understand Russia much better than I do. So if you are, certainly in the comments, because I do read through the comments because I find them to be very helpful. If there are people that are who you think would be likely to succeed Putin, please let me know. Aside from those who are in his circle that are, most of us are aware of now. But yeah, I mean, like, so I think, again, where this is going to, where we could be talking about it, I think it's likely that a year from now we'll be talking about it in various much the same way. But it also could be, if I had $1, I put 75 cents on that. But that other quarter, I distribute it to other options, and one of them being that Ukraine has partially collapsed. Russia has taken other parts of Ukraine, pushed deeper, Odessa being one of them. And now Ukraine really is that rump state that we hear spoken of, right? Where it is a broken country and it is on life support. The estimates are that Ukraine is going to require $50 billion a year for the foreseeable future from Western governments for its civil operations, not for its military, not for the war, but it's going to need $50 billion a year going forward to keep its government running, to prevent its economy from collapsing, right? I mean, so that's where it's at now. And now imagine if it does lose Odessa and it loses other parts of Ukraine, whether Kharkiv and Kherson loses more of its industrial capacity, right? More of its population density. We've already seen such a drastic decrease in the Ukrainian population, whether from people who have fled the country, which is about 6 or 7 million, people who are internally displaced, about 4 million, or those who are now part of Russian territory. I mean, so you've seen Ukraine go from a country of about 40 some odd million people down to around 30 or less than 30 million people. I mean, all these things make it so that you could have Ukraine being a zombie country if things go in a way that they could go. I mean, again, like I said, most likely we'll be talking about this in the same way this time next year, but it certainly is that possibility. And people in DC and London and Brussels, again, these psychopaths, these fantasists, these fabulous, these crackpot realists, they don't get it. Our friend Larry Wilkerson, I'm using his term. They're so wooden-headed, right? They're so wooden-headed. They don't get it for whatever reason, because they're ignorant, because they're arrogant, because they're stupid, because they're so short-sighted, because they are political focused only, and what happens today, what's going to be best for the campaign, etc. So the dangers are possibly worse than the current reality.